Start our second session about some Geniza women, slaves, and converts. And the first speaker is Moshe Yagur, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Jewish History at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a doctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters. He studies the social history of Jewish communities in the medieval Islamic Mediterranean, specifically in Egypt and the Levant. His dissertation is entitled Religious Identity and Communal Boundaries in Geniza Society from 10th to 13th centuries, Proselytes, Apostate Slaves, and will be, inshallah, submitted this summer. The title of his talk is Manumitted Female Slaves and Their Lack of, and Their Cultural Capital, or Their Lack of Cultural Capital.
No. It's working. Oh, yeah. Now you can hear me. Okay, thank you very much, Renée, and I would like to thank also the committee and the research group for having me here, also in few other opportunities throughout the year. And I will start. So, on Tuesday, April 17th, 1201, a group of men gathered in Halab and witnessed the manumission and immediate marriage of a slave woman named Mubaraka to a Jewish man named Hassan. The witnesses also testified in the same oddly phrased deed how Abu al-Faraj, the owner who had manumitted and wedded Mubaraka to Hassan, also gave the manumitted bride the dower gifts, which are usually given by the groom to the bride. It seems then that what we have here is a transaction between Abu al-Faraj on the one hand and Hassan on the other, and the goods supplied are one bride plus marriage expenses, perhaps as part of a debt or some other unknown deal between the two. Mubaraka is the product changing hands, just as slaves are traded. But in this particular deal, Mubaraka was not sold or given as a gift as a slave, but rather given as a wife. In order to be married to Hassan, Mubaraka, the slave, had to be converted to Judaism. And to do that, she had to be manumitted. But it does not seem as if Mubaraka ever became free. If she had indeed been freed, she should have been free to do whatever she desires, according to the Halakha. Or perhaps I'm being too hard on Abu al-Faraj. Perhaps he sought for Mubaraka, who had served him as a slave, surety that upon manumission she'd be married, integrated in Jewish society, and have some money for a fresh start. Be that as it may, it is clear that Mubaraka's relations and even dependence on Abu al-Faraj, her owner, did not end upon her manumission. In that, Mubaraka's case is quite illustrative of the social standing of manumitted slaves, and especially female slaves, in Geniza society. Theoretically speaking, the manumission of a slave, a Canaanite slave in Halakha, was seen as his conversion to Judaism, or more accurately, the completion of a prolonged process of conversion, which started when he or she was first acquired by a Jewish owner. The Geniza has preserved bills of manumission, documenting such cases. These are phrased more or less according to the Geonic formulae, and they state explicitly that the manumitted person can join the community of Israel, change his or her name in Israel, and do whatever he or she desires. All the bills found emphasize, in concordance with the Halakha, that the manumitted person is now totally free on his own, and the former owner or his descendants and representatives have no right or claim whatsoever regarding the manumitted slave. The reality, as is always true, was more complex. In Geniza society, manumitted slaves were considered dependent on and even attached to their former owners. This can be seen, for example, in their identification. They are called the manumitted of so-and-so. Let's recall that manumitted slaves lacked family ties or social networks other than their owners, and that in Muslim legal tradition, as in Roman law, the manumitted person was legally attached to his former owner, who served now as his patron. In Muslim law, this meant that the former owner was supposed to support his manumitted slave, could wed him or her, and was entitled to a share of the manumitted slave estate. As Craig Perry has shown, and we'll hear, I guess, more about it, Geniza documents reveal similar notions in Geniza society. Former owners supporting their ex-slaves economically, taking care of their marriage arrangements, and on the other hand, taking a special interest in their estate. We find a fine example of this in a query posed to Abraham Maimonides, found in the Geniza, along with his answer, which was published long ago. It deals with the case of a quote, Manumitted woman who belongs to El Hadar She'erit, may he rest in Eden. So let's note the phrasing belongs, although he already manumitted her and also passed away. Now the manumitted woman, anonymous of course, has also passed away and willed a small fortune to her fellow anonymous women. However, others are also counting on that sum. The city people, who wish to use that sum for public needs, but more importantly, the former owner's son. His name is Abu Taher, and like his deceased father, he bears the honorific El Hadar, which points to his social prestige. He demanded from the communal leader, the writer of the present query, that the sum will be given to him, and threatened to appeal to Muslim courts. Now remember that according to the Muslim law, he was indeed entitled to a share in the deceased estate. The writer of the query seems to be in favor of that option. He calls Abu Taher the master of the deceased, although she was already manumitted by his father. The writer also mentions the temporary economic hardships which befell Abu Taher, how this sum of money can help him, and the fact that he is, quote, beloved by the people, most intelligent, a great companion, rich in good qualities, and respected by all. To complete the picture, the questioner remarks that the women who won the estate are not even interested in it. Abraham Maimonides rules that the money of the deceased, since she is a proselyte, belongs to whoever takes a hold in it, that is, the women. But since they are not interested in it, quote, they are permitted to give it to the mentioned El Hadar. Now, the two above-mentioned examples, that of the anonymous deceased slave and that of the slave bride Mubaraka, demonstrate the fragile standing of manumitted slaves in Geniza society. While in the second case, it is quite clear that Abu Taher was looking for some easy money from these vulnerable women, the case of Mubaraka can be read in different ways. What benefit accrued to Mubaraka's owner, Abu al-Faraj, to manumit Mubaraka, wed her, and pay her marriage gifts out of his own pocket? Did he sincerely wish to care for Mubaraka with her new status as a free but lone Jewess? Or was there some other, perhaps economic understanding between the former owner and the future husband, ignoring the will of the slave-come-bride? In any case, these two examples show the continuing demarcation of manumitted slaves as such, and their dependence on their former owners. Now, this continuing dependence was relevant to both male and female manumitted slaves, and it is apparent even in their titles. Manumitted slaves are described as such, meshuchrar or meshucheret, many years, even decades after their manumission, and even in their children's legal documents, such as ktubot or commercial contracts. So a passive form, meshuchar, broadcasts to everyone, including the manumitted person, him or herself, that his legal and religious definition as a free Jewish person was determined by the actions of someone else. From here, it's but a short and logical step to be defined as the manumitted of so-and-so. Passivity and dependence were ascribed to both men and women, but such ascription impacted more negatively on the latter. Manumitted men could function more freely than their female counterparts in the public sphere and work, for example, as traveling agents, which some of them did already as slaves, managing for themselves socially and economically. These options were not available to manumitted women who generally worked as household servants during their slavery. Moreover, sexual relations played different roles in the manumission and future lives of female and male slaves. Geniza documents and contemporary responsa show that the manumission of female slaves was frequently related to an illicit sexual relationship between an owner and his slave. At least in some cases, such relationships took the form of concubinage over a lengthy period, despite legal opinions that prohibited this act. The manumission, conversion, marriage triad was a way for the community to rehabilitate the illicit relationship and protect rabbinic and communal authority. Of equal importance in such cases was the matrilineal principle, which states that only children born to a Jewish mother are considered Jewish. So, if the male owner wished a child born from his relations with his slave to be considered Jewish, he had to manumit the slave mother while the child was still in utero. This meant that both the male owner and the communal leadership had an incentive to whitewash illicit sexual exploit of female slaves by way of manumission and subsequent marriage. In this social reality, the enslaved woman is depicted as silent. We only hear or read if he converted her or he did not convert her. Now, since illicit sexual relations could lead to manumission and marriage, manumitted women and their children were subject to suspicions regarding status. Some of you are familiar with the case of the India trader Abram Beniju, his ex-slave, and his queries regarding the religious status of the ex-slave and her children. Several similar cases can be found in Geniza and in contemporary responsa. Manumission, marriage, and suspicion were so prevalent that we even find in the Geniza a tofes, a formula, this one, a blank formula for a man who bought a slave, manumitted and married her, and inspected her in all matters obligating the daughters of Israel. So if it's a formula, it means that it's been used a lot, and the writer, the scribe, thought that it would be useful to have it in his notebook. Now, of course, slaves were not all passive and powerless. Craig has identified several cases in which it seems that women tried to shape their own fate even during their slavery. I thank Oded for his, in his talk about this paradox of powerlessness which leads to agency, or if I understood you correctly. And also in this intricate situation, at least some of the slave women could use the social norms and the legal concepts in their society to try to shape their fate. I would like to specify the rest of my talk to a very singular, non-representative but interesting case of two potent and resourceful women who emerged from slavery. And to stress again, this is rather the exception than the rule, but I think it's still interesting to understand a little bit more about the rule. So the case, which is known from a response of Maimonides, concerns a family fight over an inheritance between two sisters and their female cousins. So we have the two sisters and their female cousins. At the time of writing, the conflict had already been in Jewish and Muslim court systems for quite some time, enough for one of the sisters to die and for the other to marry and have children. But this was not an ordinary inheritance matter, because the cousins brought forth a claim with immense implications. So let's listen in to the proceedings. The said sisters, the cousin claimed, were in fact not their kin. Rather, they were the children of a slave mother who were born to her before she married Reuben. Reuben is brother A. According to the query, which seems to be written by someone on the cousin side, this brother A married, quote, married a slave woman, end quote, perhaps during her slavery, and this woman already had two daughters. These girls would also be considered non-Jewish and enslaved, according to the halakha. It seems, according to the decree, that brother A never bothered to formally manumit his wife or her daughters, but rather, quote, saw it fit to attribute the daughters to himself, end quote. He also issued deeds in this spirit and named the girls as his heirs. Parenthetically, one wonders if he saw fit to treat these daughters as his own daughters because they were his own daughters, perhaps born from a premarital relationship between him and the slave mother. Now, after this brother A died, his brother B, came to town to claim his share of his brother's estate. Brother B found two sisters who presented him with the paper ketubah of their mother, showing that she married brother A at an early date. This document would leave the two sisters the legitimate, free, and Jewish daughters of brother A, and therefore his heirs. Brother B went back to his hometown, where he met people who claimed to be the witnesses signed on the original ketubah of the slave mother and brother A. Now, these people said that the ketubah was of vellum and not paper, and that the two girls were definitely born before the wedding, and hence they were slaves and non-Jewish, and so they cannot be the heirs of brother A. Brother B decided to wait. At this, does it wait? And when the sisters sent him a representative to claim their property, a dispute broke out, and courts got involved. Eventually, quote, they overpowered him with the deeds they had, using Gentile courts, end quote. As part of the compromise, brother B received some money, and the rest was left to the sisters, who also got a bill of manumission from him as the inheritor of brother A. Years go by. One sister dies, the other marries a Jewish man and has children with him. Now the cousins, the daughters of a deceased brother C, are claiming their share. According to their claim, since the sisters were slaves, as is proven by the fact that they got a bill of manumission from brother B, they were not the descendants of brother A, and so could not inherit. More than that, being slaves, they were actually part of the inheritance. So brother B gave up his part, but their father, brother C, did not, and they, as his heirs, are entitled to half of the property of brother A, as well as to half the ownership over the remaining sister and her children, who are to be treated as half free Jews and half Gentile slaves. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on the language of this query. Yes. The sisters, or daughters of a slave, and probably slaves themselves, at least from a legal point of view, are described uncharacteristically in active verbs. They brought their mother's ketubah, which they allegedly forged, presumably with the help of others, maybe a scribe or a dayan. They overpowered him with the deeds they had, and they did so using Gentile courts, which means they had not just ties within the Jewish community, but beyond it, perhaps through intercessors, maybe ties going back to their father, to brother A. They did not only try to protect what they had under their hands, but they sent a representative to collect from brother B property which he had but belonged to him, to them, according to the ketubah, which says that they are the daughters. Now let's think of the chasm here between these two sisters and their actions, and the Manumitted woman who belongs to El Hadar, which we met earlier, who couldn't even will a few dinars to her fellow women. Maimonides provides an amazing response to this amazing case. And I say amazing because he opens his answer by saying, I am amazed. Okay? He states that if the details are accurate, the sister and her children are indeed half slaves, and they are indeed owned by the cousins. But, says Maimonides, this can be confirmed only if new witnesses, besides those who signed the ketubah of the slave mother, appear and testify that the sisters were born into slavery before the mother married brother A. If such witnesses cannot be found, then the married sister is considered kosher, since she is already married. And thus, Maimonides sidesteps the severe implications of this inheritance conflict, which became a multi-generational identity crisis, and his solution is a de facto conversion of the sister and her children and a rehabilitation of brother A's dubious relationship with the slave mother. So, what happened here? Perhaps the cousins were correct in saying that the sisters lied and forged documents, that brother A was not above suspicion, and only thanks to the sisters' manipulations and use of Muslim courts, they were able to take hold of property which wasn't theirs. Alternatively, perhaps the sisters were the Jewish and innocent daughters of a legitimate couple, a Jewish man and his wife, a Manumitted slave, who fell victim to a libel perpetrated by family relatives who leveraged common feelings of suspicion towards Manumitted slave women and their children. Of course, the more reasonable reconstruction is most likely a third middle ground option. We will never know what really happened, and Maimonides didn't think he could either. However, we can know something else. Women stand on both sides of this legal conflict, augmenting their financial claims with arguments about identity. We can know that these women use the shadows of religious status and especially shadows of female religious status for their benefit. To recall, in general, Manumitted slaves, especially female slaves, and especially in the context of a conflict over their identity, are described in passive language. In other words, we hear what other people, usually their male owner and or husband, did with respect to them. Here we have a totally different case. The sisters are described as active agents, shaping their fate and improving it quite ingeniously. They are not only using arguments about identity, they also use Jewish and Muslim courts. They produce court deeds, they summon the help of scribes and representatives, and they seize property. Zinger has shown that women appealing to Jewish courts in marital disputes are portrayed in one of two main culturally recognized scripts: the complaining and beseeching woman, who should be protected by the male court, and the cursing and threatening woman, who should be disciplined. The sisters, in the case I presented, do not fit either of these scripts. Actually, they are described like normal men are described in conflicts. They exploit whatever resources they have, and they have plenty, in order to best their competitors. They control the arena. They know what should be presented in Jewish and Muslim courts. They know how to get it. They master the legal language. They know the right people to get a hold of a property or to forge a ketubah. And all this we can assume using personal ties and networks. Thus, in this unique case, we see two Manumitted women who did indeed possess cultural capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moshe. Our next speaker is Craig Perry. Craig is an assistant professor in the Department of Judaic Studies at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, in the USA, in case somebody doesn't know that Cincinnati's in the USA. He is currently working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled Masters and Slaves in Medieval Egypt, A History of Domestic Slavery and the Global Reach of the Slave Trade from the 11th to 13th Centuries. His talk today is entitled Jewish Women and Their Slaves in the Cairo Geniza Documents.
Hello, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here at the Institute, and I want to thank the organizers for putting this together and for including me in this really fascinating program. It's a pleasure to see colleagues, old colleagues, and to also make some new ones. Pull up my notes. So I hope I'll have some opportunities during my paper to highlight a lot of the connections that I'm seeing between several of the papers already, especially the ones drawing on Geniza documents, because I think that in fact they all have a lot to inform, there are a lot to say about each other. I want to talk today about Jewish women and how they use their female domestic slaves in Egypt between the 11th and 13th century. And then I also want to talk about how their female slaves accrued and used social capital as well. So I'll start with a case, which a husband, we learn, Abu Mukarram, is testifying that he's going to sell his maidservant. Her name is Ghazal, if she continues to behave evilly towards his wife. So his wife, we learn, is an elite woman. She is the daughter of the head of the Rabbinic Academy in Cairo. The name of this person is not mentioned in the document, so the document is destroyed along the left-hand side. But this doesn't surprise us because elite women frequently owned slaves and used them in a variety of ways that I'll talk about. So what we have is that a slave woman has behaved evilly toward Abu Mukarram's wife. The slave might belong to Abu Mukarram outright, or it might be that during their marriage that he has sort of dominion over the slave, even if the slave was part of his wife's dowry. So we read on the next next part something that has long intrigued me because I've tried to figure out what exactly was this slave woman doing, right, that occasioned the creation of a legal record to kind of bring her to heel and to hold Abul Mukarram to his word. So we read that, and it's somewhat fragmented, but it says if Abul Mukarram doesn't sell the slave woman after she behaves evilly again, then the wife will have the right to do so. And then in lines 9, 10, and 11, we read that she can do this if if she has any misgivings about the slave girl concerning small affairs and great ones, right? So my question has always been small affairs and great ones. And for actually many years now, I think I read this document for the first time probably 5 or 6 years ago. I assumed that she's probably talking back to the mistress or giving her a hard time. I'd never really imagined what that could be. About a month ago, a colleague of mine wrote me and said, "Hi, have you seen this responsum of Moses Maimonides? I think you're going to find it interesting." So I'll share it with you here because it helps shed some light on what could have been happening with Ghazal and Abul Mukarram's wife. So we read in Blau's editions, we read that it's in the context of a person writing with a query about ketubot formulae in the city of Alexandria. But we get this information incidentally as part of this query. So we read about a wife, right? Her husband is really pressing her on matters of ritual immersion. And the wife says, I did not refrain from ritual immersion, saying, I have been ritually immersing myself, except that because my husband forced me after I was informed by him that I was not ritually pure and that I am like a woman who has been raped and defeated. So what the query is concerned with is what to do in this situation. So the query continues, what's required in this situation? And then adds some interesting information. Further, she appears to be sick with depression and afflicted by confusion and anxiety. It is said that the reason for this is that one of the slave girls cornered her and beat her, and that the illness may be due to this. So her husband owns more than one slave. One of these slaves has cornered his wife, beat her, and in the author's perception, driven her to deep depression. So we can't be sure, and I don't suggest that this responsum refers to the legal document that we just looked at, but what it does is that I think it summons the larger world of what was socially plausible or what the historian can imagine to have happened in medieval Egypt. And it also shows us the kind of double-edged sword that slave women represented for free Jewish women in medieval Egypt. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, I would briefly say how Jewish women used slave women, and I'll give you just a very few specific examples, sort of trace out the most common ways that we see free Jewish women use slaves. And then I want to look at how slave women might have created social capital for themselves and exerted that within Jewish households. And then I want to pose some questions and make a conclusion about what this might mean for our topic of cultural capital. So first, the main ways that I'll discuss women used female slaves. First, realize they did this actively, that they were central to the demand for slaves, and they would go to court to defend their rights as slave owners. I'll discuss how enslaved women appear to us in the sources like practical kin. That is, when natal kin could not or would not come to a woman's aid, slaves often stepped in to that gap. And then I'll talk also about how enslaved women enabled seclusion and freedom from private and public labor that required Jewish women to venture into public. Here's just one example that sort of underscores the ways in which women sought out slaves. So I would say that between 25 and 30% of the parties of the known bills of sale we have from the Geniza are women, right? Either buying or selling a slave. Oftentimes we find in letters that women are the ones either initiating the search for a servant, or family members are trying to find a slave for a relative, and they write letters asking for help doing this. So here's just one example of a woman who's pregnant and who's writing her uncle, who lives south of her in Egypt, to buy a newly imported black slave girl. Into this, we could also add that women gain slaves as part of their dowries, and that oftentimes their husbands designated slaves for their wives' use, that the woman either didn't have control of, but who was supposed to have use of the slave. So, practical kin. This is an image of a document that you actually have on Miriam's handout. It is the will, or perhaps not a precisely written will, in which a woman is asking her sister, don't sell my Sudanese slave, who's described as a dada. This is a child nurse, a child caretaker. The Sudanese slave has her own son, and there's an emotional connection evident between her youngest daughter. I'll just say one more thing about this document because you have the text in front of you. This woman had an older daughter as well, right? Sit al-Sir. But from things she says in the document, it's clear that she doesn't trust her, right? She's done something scandalous that is not related in this document. But of the people who survive, it's her slave woman who she appears to have the most confidence in to raise her younger daughter. We could look at another document in which a Jewish woman, Sit al-Dalal, states in a deathbed will as well, that my slave woman Muna has attended to me in this illness and other illnesses when my mother and my sister could not come to my aid. So this pattern of slave women coming to the fore when other natal kin could not help Jewish women in medieval Egypt is a pattern. So Jewish women used slave women actively and sought them out. They relied on them as practical kin. And then the third point I'll make about how we see Jewish women use slave women is that they use them to allow their own seclusion. So as Eve Kerkowski has discussed, and I take it last week, gave a talk on at least this subject, there was an association between a woman's ability to seclude herself in medieval Egypt and her social status or her honor. So slaves, for some women, enabled this seclusion. So here we have, for an example, a record of a woman whose husband has not returned from travel, requesting additional maintenance, an additional allowance. And part of her justification is for needing an allowance is that she has a personal servant. So the allowance ostensibly is not just for this woman, but also for the upkeep of her slave. She's not expected to sell the slave to account for this allowance. She's expecting to be able to maintain possession of the slave. In explaining her case, she's referred to as one of the elite of the city who does not leave her home. So we can actually fill in what some of this labor might have been from contemporary legal codes, such as the Mishnah Torah, or even from responsa literature. So for example, the kinds of labor that would require a woman to go out in public could be fetching water, could be going to get bread that had baked at communal ovens, and so on and so forth. One responsum from Tlemcen, the medieval Maghreb, relates that in asking the Jewish jurists if they can buy Christian slave women when there are no suitable slaves available, he sort of tries to make the case that this is a really dire situation. He says, for anybody who can't have a slave, his wife and his children have to go to the well where they have to rub elbows with prostitutes and non-Jewish slaves. So in other sources that are contemporary to the Geniza, we see that there was a strong association between having to venture out in public and the kinds of labor that might be involved, but as well that this could be a kind of sullying experience in which a woman was sort of subjected to the presence and gaze of others beneath her social status. So I want to turn this question around, and I want to ask, how could slave women themselves acquire cultural capital, and how could they put that to use, cultural social capital? I keep sliding between those two terms, social and cultural capital. Help me figure out the difference. Because I have to admit, when I was preparing this paper, I don't know if I quite wrapped my mind around it. So briefly, let me show you the examples I'll give you. So first of all, seclusion for the owner meant mobility for the slave. All right, so for what it was for a Jewish woman, perhaps a luxury to be able to seclude herself, to send the slave on errands, which was the slave's work, the slave also found mobility, and I think that mobility was used to create a kind of capital for that slave. In having mobility, slaves formed their own networks. We can infer this through contemporary Arabic literary sources that describe the urban environment of Fustat in Cairo. We also know that in some rare cases, for example, that slaves were able to marry each other, right? That slaves had relationships with other slaves. And then I'm going to give you some examples of how I think slaves gain knowledge as a result of being mobile and being able to network with others in this urban environment, and how they put that to use in some very consequential ways. Finally, I would just say that manumission and the potential of manumission, as Moshe discussed, could also be a really important part of this discussion, but Moshe has already really explained to us how significant this is. So just one example of something that I think is prevalent. This is an account book of a silk merchant. So one of the things we read here are various amounts of silk, biyad ajariya, right? So silk delivered by the slave girl. This kind of activity is pretty common, both to have male slave agents do this over longer distances, but especially within the environment of Cairo locally, to have slave women go across the city to deliver things. From the occupations of slave owners, dyers, pharmacists, etc., we know that they did the kind of work that required interacting with other artisans or their customers across the city, and slave women did this work. So I am making an assumption, right, and I'm basing my argument on this assumption that when slave women did this public work, they ran into and formed social connections with other slaves, right? These sort of prostitutes and non-Jewish slaves that the Tlemcen responsum referred to. And then, in fact, they also may have met non-slave Egyptians who were laborers of a different sort, and that they gained knowledge from them about the legal regimes in Egypt and about ways that they might make more of their lot in their household. So Karl Petrie, who's a historian of the Mamluk period, so from 1250 to 1517, has written a monograph on crime in Mamluk Cairo. And one of the things that really intrigued me about his work was that he shows how slaves could get dragged into or were centrally part of a criminal underworld that was present in some urban areas of Cairo. And in his reading of Mamluk chronicles, we see instances of slaves plotting with others, with freedmen, or with common criminals to steal from their owners, sometimes even to murder them and bury them in ditches beneath bricks, right? So while I'm not suggesting that we're seeing this kind of extreme behavior in the Geniza, it makes me ask the question, about to what extent were slaves able to form these kinds of connections in Cairo. And so I'm flagging this both for myself, but also as questions to others about, can we mine the Arabic chronicles, geographies, etc., that are contemporary to the Geniza sources, to sort of flesh out this urban environment of Cairo between the late 10th century and late 12th century. So now let me show you how I think slaves put this social capital to work, this cultural capital to work. So this is actually a letter from Aydab. So this is a port city on the Red Sea. We learn that a woman is appearing before the Muslim judge, the Qadi. She explains, I was kidnapped when I went to go get water from a well, and I was sold into slavery. Kidnapping was, I think, one of the most common activities that supplied slaves to the Egyptian market. So at first we're told that she had claimed to be a Muslim, right? So being a Muslim would mean that she should not be enslaved and could not be legally enslaved. But now she's shifting her strategy, it seems, and she's claiming to be Jewish, right? And so there's a question, the Qadi wants this to be investigated. And this is what has occasioned this letter to be written from Aydab to Cairo. We can compare this to another fascinating responsum of Moses Maimonides. Would have to go on the greatest hits album, if there were a Maimonides greatest hits album of responsa, where two brothers get in a fight. The brother is so mad with his sibling that he informs on him, Halshinoto, to the Muslim Qadi. He says, hey Qadi, hey Muslim judge, my brother has a Christian slave girl. He's trying to convert her to Judaism. The Qadi summons the slave woman, and the slave sort of performs before him. She's like, I'm Jewish, and my mother was Jewish. Essentially evincing a lineage for herself for reasons that we can't quite know certainly, in order to control the situation or perhaps protect her master. So we see that slave women deploy deliberate strategies, even legal strategies, in the sources. And I argue that this is a form of social or cultural capital that they likely gain from their interactions with people outside of their immediate households, that they have access to precisely because they're mobile. So now I kind of put these two together. Free Jewish women, slave women, social capital, cultural capital. How do we think about them together? So there's no doubt that slave women could represent a double threat to their mistresses. So not only could a slave like Ghazal turn on her, or not only could a slave turn on her mistress violently, but we also have examples of husbands taking slave concubines illegally in Jewish law this time, and abandoning families. So this document actually, Oded, when he was talking about the cut-off woman, this is such a woman. Her husband, a silk weaver, has taken her slave, and he is, it seems almost certain to me, using her as a concubine at his sister's house. So this is just one of the many indignities that she describes in this petition and another subsequent one that reveals to us how slave women could be a double threat. And then on the left, for purposes of time, I won't describe a responsum of Abraham Maimonides describing a Jewish trader who takes a slave concubine and abandons his family in Alexandria. So this information has started to make me rethink something we see in a lot of marriage documents, and that is what's called the slave girl clause. We see it in two forms. The, I guess, rarer form is that in a marriage document we would see the husband's not allowed to take a slave concubine. It's more common to say that he's not able to take a slave girl that his wife hates. So for the longest time I thought that this was because it was trying to protect women, Jewish women, from their husbands using slave women for sex and creating situations that were intolerable for them. But as the situation with Ghazal and based on the responsum of Moses Maimonides, it's also made me think that those clauses exist to protect women. So the last thing I'll say is that what I wanted to do in this paper was to suggest how the social capital of Jewish women and their slaves are part of a system or process of mutual dependency, where women rely on their slaves for social capital, and those slaves also use the latitude they're given by their female owners to accrue their own social and cultural capital.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Uriel Simonsohn, or he calls himself Uri, I think, who is a lecturer in the Department of Middle Eastern History at the University of Haifa and a member of the ICOR Center for Study of Conversion and Interreligious Counters at Ben Gurion. He published a book, A Common Justice, The Illegal Allegiances of Christians and Jews Under Early Islam, as well as several articles. He is now working on two projects. One, the role of women as agents of religious knowledge and practice in early Islamic period, and the role of converts to Islam as cultural brokers. Today, his talk is Jewish Women and the Question of Kinship Ties in the Context of Conversion to Islam.
I still didn't start.
אתה לא צריך מצגת,
לא.
נכון?
תודה. As relatives of... Ooh, that's too high. As relatives of Jewish apostates and as apostates themselves, Near Eastern Jewish women could be found on both sides of the social rift that was caused by conversion to Islam. As can be expected, conversion to Islam introduced a variety of questions with regard to the endurance of kinship ties between converts and their former co-religionists. These questions, which were often posed to the Geonim of Babylonia, offer snapshots of some of the family dramas that were prompted by conversion to Islam. In most, if not all cases, the Geonim were faced with instances in which family ties between converts and their former co-religionists conflicted with halachic principles. Among those, we find more than a handful involving Jewish women who left the Jewish fold or whose husbands had done so, thus rendering the fate of their children precarious from the perspective of the Jewish community. My aim today is to review a sample of Gaonic responsa that are concerned with the fate of children whose either mother or father converted out of Judaism, in order to explore the role women could have played in determining the children's communal affiliation. Methodologically, I shall assess the cultural capitals of women, some of them Jewish, others formerly Jewish, under circumstances of conversion to Islam, by considering them in relation to comparable cases in non-Jewish sources that deal with matters pertaining to Christian and Muslim women from around the same time. The most notable set of cases involving family ties between Jews and apostates in Gaonic responsa are those between male converts and their wives. This should come with little surprise in an Islamic context, whereby Muslim men were permitted to marry non-Muslim women from the people of the book, and accordingly, non-Muslim men who converted to Islam were permitted to remain in matrimony with non-Muslim wives. Yet as we shall see, opposite scenarios were feasible as well, whereby Jewish men remained in matrimony, if only for a short while, with apostate women. The complex implications of matrimonies between Jews and apostates rear their heads in three particular categories of legal dilemmas: the fate of children of Jewish apostate couples, the release from levirate binds, chalitza, of widows of childless apostate men, and the dowries left behind by deceased apostate women. Thus, in a question referred to an anonymous Gaon regarding the legal state of a Jewish widow, we read, "That which you ask regarding a person who apostatized and has an Israelite woman who did not apostatize, and he does not have children from her, and he has a Jewish brother," unquote. The Gaon was asked whether the marriage between the apostate man and the Jewish woman remained valid consequent to the husband's apostasy. The question of Jewish apostate matrimonial bonds arises also in reverse cases involving apostate women. A responsum attributed to the 9th century Gaon of Sura, Rav Tonai Bar Hilai, speaks of, quote, "a man's wife who apostatized and died," unquote. The question section notes explicitly that the woman was bound to her husband at the time of her apostasy and at the time of her death, upon which it was asked whether the husband may claim her marriage contract and his marriage gift. A responsum attributed to the 9th century Gaon of Sura as well, Rav Tzemach Gaon, articulates the principle according to which the husband inherits his deceased apostate wife. At the same time, the Gaon noted that the apostate woman has forfeited her place among the community. Yet, be that as it may, there is nothing in the responsum that would suggest that so long as the apostate woman was alive, she and her husband were no longer together. While Gaonic responses speak of instances in which ties between apostates and their spouses remained intact, either on a legal level or merely in practice, they allow zero speculation as to the social and religious implications of these ties. These implications may be deduced from non-Jewish sources, namely Christian and Islamic, which speak of religiously mixed unions and the concerns they aroused. Of particular interest are legal questions that showed up with regard to the status of offspring resulting from such unions. Questions of this nature do not appear to have been marginal, as legal principles attempting to resolve the problem show up time and again in legal compendia of the four Sunni legal schools. The principal ruling, according to which the child was considered a Muslim once one of his parents converted to Islam, may have posed a material challenge to newly converted mothers. Thus, a Hanafi legal compendium of the 14th century, Tabyin al-Haqaiq of al-Zailai, specifies at the event of the conversion of a non-Muslim woman to Islam and subsequent Islamic affiliation of her child, the latter's non-Muslim father is responsible for providing its material needs. Accordingly, a certain level of contact between the female convert and her former husband was likely to have been retained. Further dependencies between parents and children are attested in the legal work of the 12th century Hanafite scholar Al-Kasani. The matter at hand concerned the duty of either parents or child to provide maintenance or support, nafaka, to one another, whether either one is in need. According to Al-Kasani, even in cases where when parents and their children are of different creedal affiliations, quote, it is incumbent upon the Muslim to provide for his father and mother who are from among the protected people, Ahl al-Dhimma, and upon the protected person, the Dhimmi, to provide for his mature Muslim children, unquote, on account of the so-called bonds of the womb, Silat al-Rahm. Our sources offer us some idea about the danger which relations of this type may have posed to the spiritual integrity of believers on both sides of communal boundaries. The image of a dual standing of a woman in a Muslim-dominated household on the one hand, and her affiliation with her non-Muslim community on the other, shows up in the most vivid manner in a series of questions that were addressed to the renowned 9th century Ahmad ibn Hanbal, all pertaining to the spiritual freedoms of a Christian woman married to a Muslim man. Ibn Hanbal opposed the idea that a Muslim man would forbid his Christian wife to consume wine, go out to church, bring into the house a cross, take part in Christian festivals and gatherings, and perform pilgrimage to holy sites. It may have been such freedoms that provided the setting to the 9th century neo-martyr story of Bakhos the Younger, a Palestinian monk, the third of 7 children, whose father was a Christian convert to Islam and whose mother remained Christian. According to the story, it was thanks to Bakhos' mother, who continued to attend church secretly, hoping that her children would convert to Christianity, that her son grew up to be a monk. Particular notice, then, should be made of the fate of children whose mothers either remained in matrimony with an apostate husband or apostatized themselves. A rather explicit Gaonic treatment of this problem can be found in a responsum attributed to the 10th century head of Surah, Rav Saadia Gaon. It reads as follows: a man's wife whose husband went overseas, whereupon an apostate Israelite came and married her according to the custom of the Gentiles. She gave birth to a boy, and later her husband came and gave her a divorce. That apostate violates the Sabbath in public. Now is that boy a legitimate Jew, kasher, for his father is considered a Gentile, according to the principle that a Gentile and a slave who have sex with an Israelite girl, their son is kasher. Or rather, if that apostate repented, he is a complete Israelite, and the boy is halachically considered an illegitimate Jew, mamzer. The problem at stake was whether the child born to an apostate father and a Jewish mother, the latter still legally bound to her former Jewish husband, was to be considered a legitimate Jew. In reply, Saadia ruled with resolution that the newborn was to be considered a mamzer on the grounds that it was conceived with a Jew while the woman was married to another. In other words, since the apostate father is considered a Jew, the child was born to a Jewish couple that was not considered halachically married, while the woman was still bound to her Jewish husband. Indeed, from a halachic perspective, this is a simple case of adultery. Yet from a social historic point of view, we are witnessing a matrimonial arrangement between an apostate man and a Jewish woman that carried dire consequences for the couple's child in terms of its future relations with the Jewish fold. A strikingly similar affair appears to be mentioned in what has remained of a rabbinic court record from 1220. The Geniza fragment notes that a certain woman had given birth to an illegitimate Jewish girl. The reason of the girl's tainted status was given on the grounds that her mother apostatized while married to a Jew who had not written her a deed of divorce and then went ahead and registered her marriage with an apostate in a Muslim court. One wonders why it would have been important to assess the lineage of the child of the apostate woman. If indeed both parents had chosen to renounce their Judaism, they would presumably have little motivation to argue for the child's halachic legitimacy. At this point, the only plausible explanation would be to posit an interest on the part of the Jewish community, who regarded the child as its member. Both in Saadia's Gaon's responsum and the Geniza record, we are dealing with instances that concern children born to apostate Jews and declared halachically tainted because their mothers were still held liable to their previous matrimonial commitments with Jewish men. Another case involving a halachic question about the newborn child of an apostate man and his Jewish wife appears in a responsum attributed to Rav Shrira Gaon. The responsum mentions a Jewish man who apostatized, quote, while married to an Israelite woman and later had a child born by her on a Sabbath, unquote. Since the circumcision of the newborn was to take place 8 days later on the following Sabbath, the petitioner wished to know whether the infant could be circumcised on that day. The question at hand was clearly not about the permissibility of performing the circumcision, a ceremony that entails bloodletting on a Sabbath, as circumcision precedes the laws of the Sabbath. In the absence of explicit reference to the cause of concern underlying the question, what may have been at stake was a contention over the infant's Jewish affiliation, namely that of the newborn was to be treated as a Gentile, and hence its circumcision was to take place on a regular weekday. The Gaon replied that the child was to be circumcised on the Sabbath, arguing he is an offspring of Abraham. Moreover, he argued, and I quote, the child's mother is an Israelite, and perhaps he, that is the child, will follow her. And we do not presume that he will go astray. Therefore, we do not have the power to forbid his circumcision on a Sabbath. End of quote. On the face of it, the case suggests a family household that remained intact despite the father's conversion. Yet from a legal perspective, the question at hand seems to suggest an uncertainty regarding the child's Jewishness, perhaps one that demands verification and hence justifies postponing circumcision. This uncertainty can be inferred from the Gaon's insistence that the father's apostasy applies only to himself. Yet rather intriguingly, the ensuing statement appears to offer an alternative to the position that bases a child's Jewish affiliation on that of his mother. Here, the child's future status as a Jew is conditioned by his choice to follow his mother and not his apostate father. Similar attitudes to a mother's crucial role in preserving or altering her child's spiritual inclinations are referred to in non-Jewish sources. The potential bad influence of a mother on her children is elucidated in a position found in the 9th century legal work of the Maliki scholar Sahnun, the Mudawana, which deals with the maternal guardianship of children whose Muslim father and non-Muslim father had divorced. In reply to Malik's ruling that the children are to remain under the custody of their non-Muslim mother, whether Christian, Jewish, or Zoroastrian, it was put to him that the mother might serve her children wine and pork. In reply, Malik noted that the woman could have served her children with these forbidden foods while she was still married to her Muslim husband. Yet, quote, if she wished to commit something of this nature, she should be prevented from it, and the child is not to be separated from her. And if, after her divorce, there was concern she will act in this way, she is to be attached to Muslim people, lest she does, unquote. Concerns of this latter type reveal the central position a mother would have occupied in the household, specifically her crucial place in the spiritual upbringing of her children. Yet whereas from the perspective of Muslim legal authorities, that place had to be monitored and supervised, from the perspective of some Christian authorities, circumstances of this type offered an opportunity. An encyclical letter issued by the late 7th century West Syrian patriarch Athanasius of Balad betrays, on the one hand, an ecclesiastical leadership coming into terms with religious exogamy, yet on the other hand, its attempt to retain Christian women within the fold and thus to ensure the proper upbringing of their children. Athanasius advised regarding Christian women who were married to non-Christian husbands that, quote, they should try with all their force to baptize their children, unquote. Athanasius appears to have recognized the tension that was stimulated by the simultaneous affiliation of Christian women with the Christian fold and their non-Christian families, and thus sought a middle ground by providing guidelines as to how these women should uphold the Christianity and secure the Christian upbringing of their children. Gaonic responsa discuss a variety of instances in which Jewish women and apostate women maintain different levels of filial attachments with their families. The responsa reflect the absence of Gaonic unanimity and attest to a rather widespread approach which insisted on retaining family bonds between apostates and their Jewish relatives, if only on a legal level. It is under such circumstances that women constituted a link between the Jewish community and its lost sheep. As spouses of apostate men and vice versa, as mothers of children whose fathers apostatized, and as daughters and sisters who apostatized, but their parents and siblings hadn't. If we restrict ourselves to Jewish sources, however, we can only speculate about the significance of these enduring ties. Yet when read against similar cases presented in Christian and Islamic sources, the cultural and social capitals of Jewish women take on a broader meaning. Christian and Islamic sources do not only point to the recurrence of mixed family ties that hinge on female figures, but also of the potential impact of these women. As converts to Islam, with whom marriage required that their non-Muslim spouses convert as well, whose children were now considered Muslims, and whose fathers and siblings were not shun off from their lives. At the same time, non-Muslim women whose husbands converted to Islam were able to retain contact with their non-Muslim communities, introduce non-Muslim ritual in their homes, and were likely to have played a decisive role in the spiritual upbringing of their children. Yet such assessments can be deemed feasible once we assume that Jews in general and Jewish women in particular were not all that different from their non-Jewish neighbors. Torn between their biological and emotional ties to their kinfolk on the one hand, and their spiritual and communal membership on the other, Jewish and non-Jewish women who either converted to Islam or were attached to Muslim converts were bound to be faced with a spectrum of possibilities that ran between full renunciation and full retention of their family ties. The surviving testimonies and Gaonic responsa, read along other types of evidence, suggest women were endowed with significant cultural capitals which rendered their place crucial for the preservation or alteration of creedal affiliations. Thank you. I took off a few pages.
Guys.
עובד על זה.
Okay, we're opening up the floor to questions. Okay, well, Jonathan. Stand up.
Working, yeah. Okay. So Meshucheret is Gioret, a convert, and then she cannot, a Kohen cannot marry her, or actually he can, but then the children will not be Kohanim. And so Friedman published this document, and then again Miriam Frankel published it. And so the question is it because they didn't know about this rule, they were ignorant, or they didn't care about this rule? And if they didn't know, maybe it's because they are of a low stratum of society, they are dyers and the like, all the occupations of the people signed. I don't know the answer, but it's against the law, like you said, or maybe not in full compliance with the law, but it's also against the law for her not to be totally free. So they seem like to not really be too strict with few demands of halakha. Both the Kohen and the Meshucheret and what Meshucheret should and shouldn't be doing or should be done to her.
During the early modern period, going to a non-Jewish court of law brought excommunication. So I'm wondering, was there that kind of fluidity, and what was the impact?
I refer you to Uri.
Jews and other non-Muslims, Jews and other non-Muslims turned often to Muslim courts for a variety of reasons. Some of them practical, some of them social. I don't know how much I should elaborate about this. Okay, I see your question. Okay, so first of all, according to Jewish law, there are certain instances in which recourse to non-Jewish courts are permitted for claiming debt, for instances, but others as well. So that's first of all. Secondly, the community would threaten Jews who made recourse to Muslim courts with excommunication, but to the best of my knowledge, in most cases, that threat was little implemented because it was a double-blade sword, that kind of punishment. Because at the end of the day, as a great prime minister in this country once said, it's life, hachaim atzmam, right? And hachaim atzmam, life themselves, that made often played a much stronger role in decisions people made, and the leadership had to come into terms with those decisions if, for one, it wanted to survive.
There's a great response about about a couple that went to a Muslim Qadi to get married. He was a Cohen and she was divorcee. And when they found out about it, they threatened to give the cherem because it was, really, they crossed the boundaries completely. Elisheva?
question. We have less information about slave men. They're not as well documented. I would make a couple of points though. One, I think slave men were more apt to invoke the reputation of their male owners as a way to assert their own place within a given context of other men. There's a court deposition from the city of Aydab in which a male slave agent accuses a Jewish merchant of buying a slave woman, making her pregnant, and then sort of discarding her. And he gets, this Jewish merchant wants him whipped by the Muslim governor in the city. And when he's sort of sentenced to be whipped, he says, "You can't do this to me. I am the slave, or I am the gulam of the head of the rabbinic academy in Cairo." Right? So he sort of says this as a way, like, he's incredulous, right? I think slave men seem to have acquired capital more, economic capital, and can even be found on donor rolls, like to the communal chest, for example. And so I'm not precisely sure why that is. I have a hunch, but so those are the two main things. I think they invoke the name of their master, male master, and I think that they show a pattern of having accrued more sort of money, economic capital.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you for the question. So, why should you Manumitted slaves? Maybe you also have more to add to that after me. So, you have what I'm interested about, but quite a few, I think, of the manumission documents are on deathbed wills. Already Goitan says it's like a good deed before you die, and it's also in Muslim culture. I had also maybe you also inherited her and you're not interested in some document. There's a bill of manumission of the three sisters of a person manumit their slave, like they shared slaves. So maybe they inherited her and now they manumit her as part of the will of their father. I don't know, but most of the time we just don't have the explanation. Okay, so we just Yeah, so the question is conversion like a motive or just it happens? So what? So a conversion not to Judaism but to out of Judaism. Yeah, but this was not Elisheva's question, if I understand it. There's one case that Craig discussed about a slave girl that eventually decides it's too much for her and then she converts to Islam. But then maybe you would like to talk about it. Most of the cases, we just don't know. We just have the bills or the deathbed wills. And so we can assume it was out of good intentions or for the world to come, you have manumitted the slave.
There's a document also in Miriam's handout that she didn't have a chance to discuss, and it's fascinating. A wealthy woman on her second marriage manumits two slave women, and she gives them the capital they need to enter Jewish society. But she says all of this gift is contingent upon you remaining Jews. And so I think for her, seemingly a childless woman, like it was about her showing her piety and in a way kind of trying to shore up her own legacy. But I would agree with you that the motivations are, they're just not apparent to us in what we have.
Do you think any of them actually the slaves decided they wanted to be Jewish to get out of being a slave?
Well, it's not clear to me in practice because as Moshe pointed out, like once a slave is bought, a foreign slave is bought, they're considered neither like of the goyim nor like fully Jewish. They're in a liminal state. And despite what we read in prescriptive sources, like where, you can allow this to happen for a year, but then if they don't convert, you have to sell them. I don't think we see that in Geniza documents relevant to slavery. It seems to me that wasn't a question these slave owners were asking about, whether or not to sell them because they didn't fully accept Judaism or not.
In the back there, yes, and present your name.
Okay, thank you. So the first question is, okay, the reassuring the communal authorities. So Craig already talked about response on number 211 of Manumitted. So here's another promo for reading this together over lunch. Over there, eventually, this slave girl that claimed to be Jewish in front of the Muslim judge, but actually wasn't Jewish, and the brother was living with her in the same room, in the same apartment, without ketubah. The end of the case is Maimonides says, although it is prohibited for them to be married, we should convert her, he should, Manumitted, convert and marry her. והאל טוב יתקן קלקולנו, because מוטב יאכל רוטב ולא שומן עצמו. Okay, so this is, I think, a perfect example of how you understand that החיים עצמם, he will live with this slave girl anyway. So we just better call her Manumitted, converted. Okay, now it's okay. So this is one example. We have more. The other question, a new type. I'm not sure I can do this. Maybe not in this stage. I think it's just more fitting just to the men description of men because. For men, it's legitimate, it's ordinary to be active in court. For the women, we have to put it in some script of how we deal with this phenomena. For the women, for the men, they're just acting, right? I think.
I never meant that there are only.
No, of course, just.
Most examples don't follow any script. I mean, they're just active in court, whether they're active or not. But these were just kind of extreme situations that fall into the script.
Yeah.
So they are falling to a different way.
Okay. Katarzyna, I'm a PhD student at Tel Aviv University. My thought relates to the question about the differences between the cultural and social capital and the definition of this capital at all. I've heard there are stories of women who were enslaved and freed themselves from slavery or were able to get the freedom through sexual relations. So their capital was not exactly some cultural or social abstract construct, but rather their body, like flesh and blood. So I was wondering how do we include this into the definition, or how do we change the definition of their capital? I was wondering if you can comment on that.
That's a great question, and you're absolutely. It's a very good question, and you're absolutely right to point that out. I mean, slave women were trained by slave dealers in the arts of seduction. So, I mean, in the process of getting a slave from point A to point B, if we believe slave buying manuals from the Middle Ages, like they receive sort of instruction about this, how to please their owners. I mean, it's hard to conceptualize it because one runs into an interpretive problem, right? So if slavery rests on a bedrock of coercion and violence, and so in trying to sort of theorize sex and to what extent it is a slave's agency, whether she concedes sex or however she thinks of sex with her master, whether if it's rape or if it's like conceded under coercion, I haven't quite figured out where I stand on that or how to think about it. But I think that a slave could find her status elevated. It could move her toward manumission if she became a favored slave of a master. And so you find, for example, the response on my show but did not discuss, there's kind of like a devastating line in there where the trader buys a slave, he rents her an apartment in the Fayum in rural Egypt and puts her up there. And then there's a line that says, and he bought her fine clothing, the likes of which his wife had never seen. And so you hear by becoming a favored concubine, I mean, he's showering her with all sorts of nice things. That's a serious asset, clothing. So could a slave calculate that it was in her interest to become a favored concubine? Yeah, I think yes, right? So, yeah, great question.
Ruth. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Just to add one more, I cannot reconstruct what they were thinking and so, but just from the legal point of view, the same female slave bought by a Muslim owner in Cairo, so he could, let's call it, sexually exploit her, and it won't make her free, even if she will give him children. But after he will die, she will be freed, and her children are considered Muslim from the beginning. On the other hand, if she was bought by a Jewish owner, and he wanted the children to be considered Jewish, he had to manumit her. And conversion meant manumission. So this was, don't know if I can call it cultural capital or whatever other capital, but these were the norms, and these were the concepts in that society.
Sexual capital. I'm not sure if this is how it happened, how it's described, but this is how it's described. This is also important because in other queries, like the same genre, halachic queries, responsa, it's always he converted her, or he did not convert her, or he used her, he bought her apartment, and so. And here it's they did this, they produced, they forged, they sent. And so I found it interesting that they are in the same legal query, exceptional legal query that discusses active daughters of a slave who eventually managed to become free Jews without manumission, without conversion. They are also depicted in active language.
That's an active language that goes against the usual formulaic language.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Rebecca? Still.
No, she's not freed. We have a lot of cases of ambiguous manumissions, and there are Gaonic precedents too, where a deathbed declaration in any language was supposed to be valid, and it would be written down later. We also have examples of relatives afterwards trying to undo this process. Conditional manumissions, the only one I can think of is a young girl, named Kashf, is her owner in his will says, I'm giving you to my sister Sitariasa, and essentially when you get older and you want to leave, you can leave, but if you want to stay, you can stay. You know, so she's remaining a slave, but I guess that's the only thing I can think of as sort of close to, I guess, what we might call conditional manumission. There's another deathbed will, Sita Dalal, about her slave Muna, says, the slave woman is so important to me. Never sell her or have her bought or harmed. What does that mean? I mean, that's very ambiguous. It could mean like she's going to have slavery in perpetuity as part of the family. Perhaps Muna is an older slave and is terrified of freedom, or we can also imagine that possibility. So, but no, we don't see the kind of contracts. You have that in Islamic law. The mukatib slave can agree to have purchase freedom, but in the Geniza, in the Jewish community, we don't see that. Although I suspect the male slave agents might. We don't have evidence of it, but they might be working under some sort of similar arrangement.
Shira? Reluctantly standing up.
I wanted to go back to the conclusion and there's this ratio between the illegal security and the slave role. I don't know. Sorry. So, it seems to me that when female slaves probably prefer working for less motivated shopping, it sounds like the male slave could be used in economic transactions because they can money. Put that as a dispute. To me, it sounds like the market of the elite woman actually limits her, restrains her, thinking of down the street. That is, the case where the elite woman buys into it, even though I think it's horrible restriction of practice. So the Jewish world is not from the Islamic world, is the status is different. And what do you have to say about the paradox of this internalization or restriction of one movement, actually, anything else connected, as a market of elitism, and then the slave has a kind of mobility that the woman doesn't.
Can I punt this question to you? I think you're better equipped to answer the question. I would just say my reaction is that it's a culturally situated notion of what honor is. And so, yes, from my perspective, it is a part and parcel of a patriarchal system that does not favor women. However, you've thought about this more than I have. The question was about...
We also know that the women who were very elite did not want to go to the courts, and they would come to their houses, and that was considered to be perfectly acceptable because they...
Talk about social capital, cultural capital, economic capital, with a disjunction between them here. The woman who has the wealth, I don't know if she has really exercise of it, is, to me, denied social capital in terms of moving around.
But that's an interpretation that is made from high into the modern period, assuming that someone who's staying at home is secluded or being discriminated in some way. That doesn't necessarily have to be the situation. It could be actually a privilege.
Well, it is a privilege, but it's one that restricts you and constrains you.
A privilege of a woman's privilege. She doesn't have to.
That's the internalization of a patriarchal society in which being a certain position restricts you. It's paradoxical. The same thing happens with the job. It's true. I mean, that was the environment that was first used by Ottoman women, and then it trickled down. It's the same. I think you're right. So it's just a complex. It's a complex. What?
Okay, I've been told that for the members of the conference, there's lunch and there is no heating system, so our lunch is getting cold. So I just want to end it by saying that as someone who started her research with conversos and converso women, and in medieval Spain, I have never seen a maidservant hitting her master and mistress. I've seen the masters and mistresses thrashing and bashing and breaking pitchers over the heads of their servants because they messed up the kashrut, and also with the relation between converts and the Jews. It's extremely interesting, as I think about also how the converts to Christianity in medieval Spain dealt with the Jews before 1492. So we thank you all for a very enlightening session.